When you want your spring break to feel like... and your kids' pool day to feel like... and your hotel bed to feel like... ooh, and room service to feel like... because at Hilton, hospitality feels like...
Your cabana's ready. Would you like fresh towels?
It matters where you stay. Book now at Hilton.com. Hilton, for the stay.
Shopping is hard, right? But I found a better way. Stitch Fix online personal styling makes it easy. I just give my stylist my size, style, and budget preferences. I order boxes when I want and how I want. No subscription required. And he sends just for me pieces, plus outfit recommendations and styling tips. I keep what works and send back the rest. It's so easy. Make style easy. Get started today at stitchfix.com/Spotify. That's stitchfix.com/Spotify.
Watch The Toxic Avenger now on Screambox. The radioactive superhero that's certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes is available to watch now from the comfort of your home. Bloody FM listeners get a special introductory offer by going to bit.ly/ToxyFM. That's bit.ly/ToxieFM for a special offer on Screambox.
Sometimes you gotta do something.
Welcome to Safe Room, your weekly source for horror gaming discussions and proudly part of Bloody Disgusting's Bloody FM podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week we've got another roundup of some features to talk about and a general grab bag of games. As was established with our first episode of the year last week, we're taking a slightly alternate approach to the show in which we do just that. We have a feature segment that kind of like highlights either a game that is topical for, being timely, or at the same time, maybe a game that one of us has been revisiting and we kind of have a new approach to chatting about it, or an approach in mind rather, for chatting about it. If we find that, there was some notable news that week, we'll maybe cover a little bit of that, and then we'll round out each episode with a general, grab bag, if you will, what you've been playing kind of approach, because, we're not always playing just the brand new releases. We're always, diving into a variety of horror games and, games that maybe don't even operate entirely within the standard approach to horror. Maybe it's a subgenre of horror or a horror adjacent genre. We just kind of like have these overall, a little bit more freedom to chat about, whatever kind of comes to mind. But this week, we're going to kick off, our feature of the week, with something that is quite timely, that being Dead Space 2 turns 15. Neil, do you want to kick things off, like for you, with Dead Space 2? We've clearly covered the original Dead Space and, the Dead Space remake a few years ago. Like, what about that sequel stands out to you the most, maybe 15 years later?
Oh, man. Yeah, it's one of those as well where I had to look back at our episodes and go, did we cover it yet? I'm sure because we talked about it so much on those episodes, I think, as well, which didn't sort of help. But wow, I mean, it's established before, it's my favorite Dead Space for so many reasons. But I think it's because it's a more relentless survival horror experience than the first one. It has that kind of escalation we saw between the first Resident Evil and the second one, where it's like, you feel a bigger sense of chaos, the wider world. Again, you go from Ishimura to like an entire cityscape effectively in space. And yeah, that really, really did it nicely. And it just evolved, what happened with Isaac, because, that was only just kind of beginning in the first game. And yeah, before it got a bit silly with, the whole, like, seeing disturbing images and like what is real sort of stuff kind of got out of hand in certain horror games after that. I think it was just the nicest balance in terms of that schlocky sort of melodramatic horror. It worked really well for it. I mean, more than anything, I think it's got one of the all-timer openings of any horror game, like ever. Like just the sheer chaos of like, going from a hallucination to finding your basically, Isaac is just like being interviewed for a psychiatric sort of interview to ending up with the necromorphs basically invading that horrible time and taking over the facility, and in a straitjacket having to kind of run your way through like all this chaos going on. It's again, it's like, drops you in the deep end in a way that obviously the first game was more building up to that, like that. While the instigating incident in that game happens fairly early, you do get a bit of like run up to it, like that, which is helpful in that sense. But here, it's like go from the off and really sets the pace perfectly for it. I think it's just also got such a wonderful set of monsters, the necromorph thing. It really gets to evolve and we get more of the different kinds, which is a sequel, of course, it's going to happen. And the weapon set just gets better as well. The laser cutter was great in the first game and it's the iconic weapon of the series, but I think all the weapons around this and the enemies they are there to take on in most cases as well. It's a really good balance of the things, and none of them really take away from the pace of it all. And despite this sort of relentless nature of the game, I do think it still manages to have moments of like tension and like ratcheting up in moments of quiet, like that. It's just the moments of quiet are smaller, and in comparison to the first game. And for me, in terms of the kind of horror games I like, it was perfect in that regard. It just sometimes there are horror games where they are building the tension, and in a way, it kind of dissuades me from pushing on like that, which is annoying sometimes. It's not the game's fault so much more. It's just my approach to those things. I don't really want to go have the big loud moment. That's true of stuff like Silent Hill 2, for instance. Where I just when it does really get into the action of it, it just feels a bit like I'm doing stuff beyond just sort of ambiently taking in everything. It's a great sort of push you forward, let you get into these horrible situations, and even like the little set piece moments where you can basically be killed in some horrible way, inventive way, like that. They just happened so abruptly, and it was in an age where the QTE had kind of had its day. It was nice to have a game just bringing it back to reactions. Use your reactions in this moment, and the camera framing it. There's that thing with the where a window blows out and you have to try and shoot the shutter down to stop yourself getting blown out into space. like just like that, and the way it's framed and the way the camera changes and focuses exactly where you need it to without it being like to smack you over the head obvious. It's just some great ways of like showcasing like this game in its action sense. And as much as I bemoan action heavy horror games sometimes, I think given the nature of the necromorph threat and given what it should have escalated to after the first game, it makes perfect sense for me in a way that others wouldn't necessarily in sequel terms, where you're like, doesn't have to be this kind of action. It's everything to me in terms of one of my favorite survival horror games ever as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that the game having an even greater emphasis on like body horror, right, and the psychological horror was something that you sort of expect, right, with the sequel, but at the same time, like it refines it rather than completely redefining it. You know what I mean? Like I think that it was one of those things that it felt like a natural continuation, and yet the sort of like sicko meter got turned up a little bit more, to the degree that it's the perfect kind of approach to a sequel because of the fact that anybody that people that played the original and enjoyed it and loved it as much as we did, it was one of those things where like your mind can't help but think like, what if they did this instead? What if the necromorph mutation or somebody bursting into a necromorph or whatever like unfolded like that? And then naturally the game kind of just like runs with that in a manner that was so gruesomely satisfying to see. And like you'd mentioned, that opening is you very rightly described it as one of the best openings in any game, and there's really no other way to view that because of the fact that it really just like not only kind of very plainly sets the tone of what you should be expecting with the sequel and those elements getting ratcheted up, but also it really is like the ultimate reminder of, Isaac being that everyman, right? The fact that you're completely neutered in that opening section because you're literally in a straitjacket, you don't have a weapon, and the game's beginning with Isaac on the back foot already. I found was one of those really phenomenal choices in terms of just like reestablishing the character, reminding players that this is not the super soldier that you thought it was, and that ultimately leads into what for me is like one of the biggest additions with the sequel, which is that quite plainly Isaac gets a voice. This time around, he's voiced by actor Gunnar Wright, and who also did not only voiceover but did motion capture, and like this was such a phenomenal addition because of the fact that Isaac's already an empathetic character from the original game. It's the nature of trying to find your girlfriend, right? Trying to find her on the Ishimura and whatnot. But now, like, you actually can get into the head of Isaac a little bit more so because of the fact that he not only has a voice, he talks about how he feels, what he's thinking, and for a game that delves even deeper into the psychological horror subgenre, like that's exactly what's needed. And I think that that's the aspect that those continued hallucinations from the previous game to kind of like work a little bit better. It feels like Isaac's able to reflect on that. You're also able to see hallucinations manifest that you're kind of given a primer for almost in some moments because of things that he's been saying or reflecting on. And yeah, ultimately I found that, him being the everyman, that's a great description for a character that we've seen work previously, but I think really getting to actually like hear from the man himself is one of the things that makes Isaac Clarke probably one of my favorite characters in a horror game, and certainly in a survival horror game at that. It's just such a very personal role. And, I was doing some reading on the development of the game, and they said like John McClane was a reference for the everyman approach, which at first I was kind of like, And then, you think about it and you go back and you play any of Dead Space 2, like Isaac Clarke really does strike that perfect sort of balance of someone that's very capable, but at the same time, he has moments of humanity that are, whether it's him being a smartass, a comment that he makes, but there's, I think, overall just like such an even-handed approach to his character that doesn't allow him to ever kind of like talk too much, or his having a voice ultimately like overshadowing an aspect of the storytelling that worked so well in the first game. It just ended up being the aspect that was sorely needed, even if Dead Space 1 is completely still playable and enjoyable without Isaac speaking.
Yeah, I think continuation of the suit as well being a good way to sort of signpost what you need to do, like that. Everything being mechanically shown through that suit is wonderful. Yeah, I love that, and it really helps in terms of building in that problem we'd had, I think, with survival horror at that point, where it was you can't really do like the lo-fi sort of no HUD sort of thing. It didn't work quite the same way with everything going on. They do really try their best to kind of strip all that back and have the suit do the job in telling you the story, whether it be the health or whether it be like directional markers where you need to go, sort of thing. And that's perfect. Yeah, I love that. And then, even in the weapons thing, which is always fun, just the ammo count being part of the weapon, and all these things help. And I think that's why it stood out at a time when many companies, ironically even EA included, were sort of going, "Oh, this horror thing doesn't really work quite as much as we thought it would," sort of thing. And it was kind of like, to me, like the last hurrah of that era of like survival horror before bewilderingly big companies decided that we don't want these kind of games anymore, like for us. Obviously the game's still being made by other companies, but yeah, the big tentpole survival horror stuff really kind of, this was the peak of that run, I suppose, we had from the PlayStation era onwards.
Yeah, for me, when you talk about combat and like gameplay in the original Dead Space, right? I think I had gone on ad nauseum when we covered the original and the remake and chatting about like the main gun, what is it? The laser cutter. There's a different name for it, I think. But anyways, like I have talked about how phenomenal of a weapon that is. And, to the degree that I never even used any other guns in the game, because I thought that that was just like such a great versatile weapon. Plasma cutter. That's what it's called. Plasma
Yeah,
cutter.
that's good.
Yeah. And, like, so the notion that this game, had an expanded arsenal and whatnot, but for me, I was such a purist with that approach that what really separated the gameplay here from the original was the fact that you can weaponize kinesis now, right? It's not just used anymore for environmental traversal and moving, shipping crates and containers to make bridges or just to move them out of Isaac's way, but you could literally like pick up objects in the environment and hurl them at enemies and kill them. And, even more satisfying, you could sever the limbs on an enemy with your plasma cutter and then use kinesis on the fallen limbs and use those as projectiles, which I just found to be like such a satisfying new approach to combat that also like further emphasize the survival horror aspect of this. A lot of people compare Dead Space 2 to like being more action oriented in terms of like horror games, but I found that like this element of it compared also or complemented also by the overall difficulty spike I found with Dead Space 2, especially on the older or the harder difficulties. This new weaponizing of kinesis was just like, it's basically like replacing the bean counting of weapons and, ammo with this, and that being sort of like the last sort of like survival option in some scenarios, right? I think the environments getting larger almost, I found, naturally are going to be littered with a number of like spears or, explosive tanks. But the fact that you could literally rip off chunks of enemies and use them as weapons was kind of like full circle moment that really does show you that this game does, emphasize the body horror in a whole new way, and not just against humans, but also, Isaac using that as a means of defense and offense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the most fun things about it. It's the whole gravity gun thing again, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
a weapon that is just fun to use because of what it means. I love any game that kind of lets me just take things from the environment and use them as projectiles properly, like that. And yeah, when you get those like rebar type bars, that you can just pick up and just fling through enemies and just spear them to the wall and stuff. Great. But yeah, I think there was like a trophy or achievement for like doing a limb of a necromorph and just knocking it through the head like that, and it's beautiful. It just adds another sort of layer to that already great stuff that was there in terms of like the limb removal as it was, and just such a great weapon set upgrade, I think, and that is a big part of it.
Yeah. And also, like, I think as great as the Ishimura was as a setting, I really love the sprawl as well. I found that was one of those, I guess if you want to compare, the Ishimura being inspired by sort of or similar to the claustrophobic corridors of like the Nostromos from Alien.
Yeah.
Then, the sprawl is kind of like Hadley's Hope, but in space in a way where, you've got these apartments that you get to explore in marketplaces and shops and also like a school, which, we've chatted about being one of the most memorable levels, not only in Dead Space 2, but one of the most memorable sections of any horror game. And you don't get that unless you have that approach to like this mega space station that is intended for people to be living in, not just like a mining vessel. And like that furthermore allowed the narrative to kind of like go down the route of seeing the effects of the Church of Unitology and all of those things and the influence on people and whatnot. And that ends up being like a really great aspect, I think, of the storytelling as well, that is kind of like complemented by that environment. So I think, all these years later, Dead Space 2, which, hopefully we are going to be getting a remake of in the near future, maybe, hopefully. I think that there's still a really, really strong example of a sequel, adopting that the bigger, better mentality. However, it really is just like further refining the aspects that made the original work so well, and kind of just like being that dream sequel checks all those boxes.
Yeah, I think even like replaying it when around the time of Dead Space remake, And it was like it was so good still. It just really did hold up nicely. Like it's the perfect sort of mix of stuff from that era. Not a lot of games from that sort of PS3, Xbox 360 era necessarily hold up when they're in this sort of third person sort of view thing. Like there's stuff about it like we did kind of peak past just at the end of that generation maybe. But yeah, I don't know. It's sleek in a way that unfortunately is a byproduct of like EA, and what they wanted from the game to make this big blockbuster thing. But yeah, that made a great sequel. It's just obviously that got pushed too far a bit with the next one, and subsequently led to this whole sort of idea of, well, these games aren't doing as well as we thought they would with all the money we pushed behind them, and somehow making them failures despite being successful. Oh well, we got that remake. I suppose the only sort of problem we got now is, does the second one happen? With the takeover of the company and with the new ownership having certain avenues they don't like going down. Like, we may see problems. I know that's been brought up about other franchises like The Sims, for EA, where there's a lot of stuff in that won't necessarily wash with the new owners. But yeah, it's be interesting to see if it does get to continue. But I mean, hopefully one of the upsides is we don't keep having companies folded one into the other, into the other, into the other with EA anymore, and so they don't just end up having to go making bits of another game for someone and can just make Dead Space 2. And we can or remake Dead Space 2 in this case. But yeah, anyway, Dead Space 2, fantastic, and I still recommend playing it to this day because it still has the source.
It absolutely does. And that'll bring us to our second feature for the week, which is chatting a little bit about, the upcoming and imminent release at this point of Resi Requiem, right? The next chapter in the Resident Evil franchise, which we are obviously very excited for and looking forward to covering. And, this kind of like was kicked off by the showcase that they had for Resident Evil Requiem recently. And that kind of got us thinking, like, there was a portion of that presentation where they talk about the parallels between the two sides of the Requiem coin, if you will, where you play as Grace and then you're also playing as Leon Kennedy, fan favorite. And something that they mentioned was the fact that, with Grace's character, that's going to be the aspect of gameplay that is more indicative of like Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 7, that being the more horror approach to the experience. Whereas they said that the Leon portion is going to be more in the vein of Resident Evil 4. So naturally more action oriented. And they talked about this range of an experience that the primer is going to be the like tension of the Grace portions. And then you have this cathartic release in the Leon sections that are more, as I said, action oriented and more just like action packed, if you will. And that kind of just, got us thinking about how is that balance going to work? And, as with any balancing act, you really need to strike something that feels like you're giving both sides of that gameplay experience the sort of like proper amount of time and attention, because otherwise, it could turn into this sort of like unbalanced experience. So for you, Neil, like, what are your thoughts on that balancing act of the two gameplays, and what is like a fear of yours perhaps in how they're having this approach to gameplay?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing to sort of add here, I suppose, is that there's always been like other sections in Resident Evil games, but it's always been different in how it's been done. Previously it's either been two similar style campaigns or a majority of one style with a smattering of another. See, like Chris is bit in the end of Village, or Ashley in the Resi 4 remake. They one's very action heavy, the other is like more of the helpless horror where you are just vulnerable and having to get stuff. And even Resident Evil 2 remake, in terms of like having little bits in there that they had for Sherry, and like with the DLC there was some of that too. So that's been the thing. There's always been an imbalance. It's either all the same for two campaigns, like Jill and Chris or Leon and Claire, or it's been a little bit a smattering of something else in there. Now here they're promising 50-50 balance. Effectively, it's all the one campaign, and some bits will be Grace, then it'll be Leon, Grace, Leon, Grace, Leon. That's where it kind of, I'm like, okay, so are we confident that Capcom can sort of handle this new balance? Or is it going to become jarring going from all action Leon Kennedy Resident Evil 4 to Resident Evil 7 style gameplay? And yeah, that was like my knee-jerk reaction to it. It was like, I don't know, because when I think back to those previous games where they've had a bit of a different kind of game in it, it's sometimes not felt like it fits. Like that. It's a nice sort of break occasionally. Like the Sherry thing in Resi 2 Remake is okay as a break, like for a little bit. And the Ashley thing, yeah, that's okay, like that. But Chris in Village, for instance, like it's fun as a sequence or as a bit to do being Chris, but I think it's not enough removed from what Ethan's doing by that point that it really doesn't feel like. It feels a bit odd that Chris, I am a normal guy in Redfield feels more indestructible than the man who can't fucking die. Like it's a strange sort of mix. So they always, that felt very jarring, for instance, and obviously that was the last mainline Resident Evil game. If you're not counting remakes, of course. So I don't know. I was feeling a bit skeptical at that point, thinking I like that we're getting like two protagonists again, and maybe with being so different, it's a good thing that they aren't separate campaigns. Because that then you are just pretty much saying, well, this is very different to this one, so it's very much down to what kind of horror game do you want, sort of thing. And instantly in my head, it was like, well, I know I'm probably going to like the Grace side better because I'm, as much as I admire Resident Evil 4 and its remake, it's not my preferred Resident Evil style. So, but I think because of the types of gameplay they're doing, maybe I don't feel so bad about it. I mean, being truthful and honest up front about that kind of helps, rather than finding out on your own. Like that, Grace will be like this, and it'll be like these games. Leon will very much be like what Leon should be like. Okay, we get it. That's fine. So yeah, and there's those little tweaks they showed in the gameplay, like to stuff we already know, like the parry system from Remake 4 is back, and albeit with an axe that you need to sharpen up and stuff. And the idea that Leon could just pick up stuff from the environment to use as well is quite interesting. So yeah, I suppose it'll depend on how the story plays out and how the structure of the game is as to how you pace that. Because we were just talking there about Dead Space 2 and like how the pacing goes and how you can have quiet moments that aren't as long, but they help to sort of build the momentum in a way that isn't just repetitive, knocking you over the head with the same loud, fast, shouty, bloody, gory like that. And yeah, that's the thing they've got to get right. I think they've got to find the right rhythm between the two campaigns and not have one style encroach into the other. Like they have to feel like very two distinct play styles.
No, that's going to be the crux of, how successful this approach is. Because, I don't have any issue with them, including being able to play as two characters in one campaign. But my whole thing is like that balance has to be perfect. And you really can't have one aspect dominating the experience over the other, because my fear would be that they're going to lead with the Grace aspect of it to establish the narrative for the game. And then, they might gravitate away from that because it's like, oh, this is a great sort of like primer for the next chapter in Resident Evil. You get to, have some new lore or expand on that lore and whatnot, present this more horror focus. And then, as much as I love Resident Evil 4, I just don't want to play an experience that is bookended by something that ends up being a little bit more unique. And while, if Leon's sort of like approach to gameplay like dominated the experience, I'd still really enjoy it, but I'm just more interested in an experience that is able to kind of tap into both aspects of what I love about Resident Evil, which is, again, that two and 7 influence, but also like I love Resident Evil 4. And I just would be somewhat worried that like not balance out those experiences would just kind of like make me annoyed by the presence of the one over the other if they just like
Yeah.
lead with one more than, as I said, the other. But, I think in regards to like any other aspect of this game, there was something that was mentioned during that showcase that I was interested in, and I don't know if it would end up being anything more than just like this brief little aesthetic aspect of design, but like they talked about the zombies retaining a bit more of their humanity, right? Of things that they did prior to their zombification. And, I think that those defining characteristics would be interesting outside of like a narrative context. Like I don't need cutscenes where, zombies are talking and, all that kind of thing, like Land of the Dead style. But I do like the notion that it would provide a bit more individuality amongst like fodder enemies. Like you see
Yeah.
a patient in one of those scenes where they're like dragging one of those IV stands, and another you see a butcher that is going about their occupation. They've got, naturally a butcher knife, and, that goes right into sort of the parrying system for combat. But I just thought that like that was a cool little thing that they didn't spend a lot of time on. And it's not going to redefine Resident Evil for me, but it would avoid issues that I had with Resident Evil 7, which was that all those blob monsters and goo monsters look exactly the same. And, as much as I love the Ambler zombies in naturally classic Resi and whatnot, this would just be something that gives them a bit more, as I said, individuality or differentiating features to them to kind of just like, not make you annoyed that you've killed, 50 zombies that all look exactly the same kind of a thing. So that was the only other little thing that they had mentioned. But yeah, in terms of that balance, actually, there was one other thing, unless you had anything else you wanted to add. I had one more note from that showcase.
Literally, just say from what you said, like it kind of reminds me of Siren Blood Curse in terms of like having like zombified enemies still going around chatting and feeling a bit human, like that, which is fine. Like do it, but like don't sit there and pretend like you didn't really already do this in Resident Evil 4, like having zombies not be zombies, that sort of thing. Yeah, like there's a space definitely for like evolved zombies. I think that there's some great, interesting exploration of that. It's just if you're just redressing, what we had in Resident Evil 4, then it's like you just say it's like that. Like you don't have to say there's zombies.
Yeah, the only other thing that I had was like they talk about the crafting system, which naturally has always been an aspect here. But I think the thing that stood out to me that was more interesting was the fact that you can collect zombies' blood, basically, that will impact what items you can craft and whatnot. And the reason that I thought that that was notable was that, that speaks to Grace's character a bit more because of the fact that, when they're talking about her side of the experience, combat is obviously a factor, but they also emphasize the fact that, the player, it'll be up to their decision, like what portion of this are they going to stealth their way through? What portion of this are they going to actually engage in combat with her? And so, the emphasis or the ability now for being able to collect blood from killing some zombies, that sort of like promotes the notion that Grace is going to have to seek out combat at certain points. I don't know the full extent, obviously, to the blood's involvement in like crafting. I assume it's going to be crafting much more powerful items. But that's something that I think is sort of like interesting that, while the choice is there, at the same time, like players will still have to engage in combat from time to time.
They did show that bit, obviously, what looked like a syringe made from that blood, I think, where it just explodes a zombie, which is...
that's what it was,
Yeah, which is interesting. Yeah, like that's probably one application, but I think you're right, there probably is more to it than just that. But yeah, again, it's good. There's got to be some secrets. We can't know everything. But yeah, it's like, I suppose that's all it's come through. This is we had more questions as a result of like seeing more, which is good. Like I don't think the Porsche stuff is going to be as big as they're making out. Like that. I think because they've hyped it up so much, it makes it like, oh, so this could be open wheel driving, like or something. Like I'm not so sure now. I'm a bit more like no, given the way they presented that and watches in that showcase, I think, yeah, like, sorry. Also, like here, expensive as fuck watches that you can buy that characters in the game wear. Like it's like great. like
Only
yeah,
previously outdone by those Death Stranding watches.
yeah. It's like, but then that feels more like Kojima's bit, like
Mm.
that, and having merchandising, branding, like stuff like that. Resident Evil is like Porsche, like it's like and a watchmaker thing, and just having those people on a showcase when they don't, how it is when you have a company just tying in with something they don't really know much about, like it just, yeah, when they just come on to those sort of presentations, it's like, okay, it's like market opportunity, we get it, that's fine. So
Yeah.
for whatever reason, but yeah, it was an odd one.
Yeah, but I think at this point, kind of like you'd been saying, we do still have some questions, but fortunately for us and everybody else, we don't have that much longer to wait. It's coming right around the corner, so that's naturally that'll be dominating our week where we get to cover finally getting our hands on Resident Evil 9, and we'll get to unpack that and see that balance between for ourselves and see how well Capcom is able to do that. But yeah, before we get into sort of our grab bag, what you're playing for the week, we're going to take a quick break and then we'll dive right into those picks. But more on those in a moment. And we are back from our break. And Neil, what are you bringing to the table this week? What have you been playing?
Just the one game, which is I went back to Wolfenstein 2. I could say no reason, and people wouldn't believe me, but it was actually watching Sisu Road to Revenge that kind of got me back into it. And the idea is because that film is like a video gamey as fuck film. Like it really just like, I mean, there's stuff in there that video game makers would be like, nah, that's too much. But given what it is, it's just like the carnage and the bloodshed and the silly over the topness. It did have me hankering to play Wolfenstein 2 again, and I hadn't replayed it since like I think reviewing it back in the day. So like, and obviously reviewing something before release tends to be quite a hurried experience sometimes. And I definitely felt that in returning to it because it felt more open as an experience, even though it's quite straightforward. The levels aren't that big, and there's a lot of similar sort of things to it. But yeah, to me, it kind of held up quite nicely. I mean, for very obvious reasons, I guess, in terms of the story. I mean, if you remember, there was a real fuss around the game when it launched, and it's how certain people were very offended that it was very nasty to Nazis, which is seemed silly then.
Yeah.
Now it's like, oh yeah, we get why now.
Who knew that "Kill All Nazis" tagline would be so triggering? But here we are.
Yeah, and that was a decade ago.
Yeah.
And I was imagining just how much worse that would be now. And with the fact that we have had like talk of like a third one is in the works from Machine Games, which great, fantastic. But replaying this and seeing just how brazenly they get away with it now, it's like I do wonder, God, would they make the same game in terms of like tone and like really in your face, like fuck this shit sort of thing. Like the ending of that game is like fist pumping, gleeful, cathartic sort of violence, like, and the whole speech of it, like the whole blast of it's like you among wolves sort of thing, like is fantastic. It's just it's just mad how like good it feels to this day in that regard. And even in like its silliest moments, like spoilers for anyone who hasn't played it, but like Hitler not being dead but living on Venus, effectively, like just it's daft, but also Hitler living on Venus, auditioning actors to play Blazkowicz, and being a senile old man pissing into a pot and like killing anyone who doesn't agree with him, again feels really, really, really topical. Like at this point, like, but yeah, away from that sort of stuff, getting to see like the after effect of like what happened, in terms of like the Nazis continuing to like dominate and like take over the US. Like the New York level with the Nuketown City and stuff like that is like really, brief as it is, it's haunting. When you get through certain bits of that and it's all blown apart, and I say brief in terms of like how long it feels like that for, because I think then the game gets to be more action heavy, and the game kind of gives you the excuse of, well, you're wearing a suit that can survive radioactive material for most of the time, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, it's nice when you get these little glimpses. I think like the New Orleans level as well, like has some really good sort of visual history in terms of like what you see in the level. And I don't know, the New Orleans setting makes it feel very like spooky and like ethereal. There's something off about it in a way that's more than just what's happened to it. Yeah, it's just incredibly violent and funny as hell. Still, I think as well. Like there's just so many little bits in the background of cutscenes and stuff where it just asides where you just, yeah, that's good, that's funny. Like, yeah, it's still a fantastic game in so many ways. I'm don't like its pinging system in terms of like finding your objective. That's still very iffy, but yeah, in terms of like the weapon stuff, the dual wielding, like, and even the stealth, I got on with it a bit better this time. I mean, when I played it originally, I could not do the stealth at all. I was like, I get caught within seconds or like that, and all hell would break loose. But I don't know, it didn't matter this time. I was just like guns blazing whenever that happened, and it was fantastic. Yeah, so I mean, no great revelations, I suppose. Just that, apart from the fact that I feel like the game did get like a dressing down after launch, where people bought into the marketing hype and chose sides and stuff based on that. But then there was kind of like downer thing that happens with a lot of games after they come out, where like, actually it wasn't that good, blah blah blah, for this reason. Which criticism's fine. Like, and we should do examinations of games post release to sort of go, well, maybe with time we can see that this was wrong with it or this was right with it. But yeah, I think for so many reasons it's still like great stuff for machine games. Yeah, so yeah, I do hope that if they are making a third one, that they get to have the same freedom that they had with this and go mad crazy with it. I was going to play Youngblood again as well, but I didn't get around to that, unfortunately. But obviously that being like set in 20 years odd from this game as well was interesting, and in terms of what will they do for the next full Wolfenstein game. Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, I was always a fan of naturally Machine Games' approach to this, and I found that the new Colossus really did kind of like tap into the horrors of the aftermath, like you'd mentioned, right? Getting, especially like that parade section when you're walking around downtown. I think maybe it's Dallas or something, but naturally all the Nazis are there, and then you see that the Nazis and the Klan are now openly wandering around and everything, and have allied, and that would being one of those sections that has no combat in it, but it really just allows you to kind of like soak up that atmosphere and whatnot. Which I think, furthermore, the fact that you could have two experiences in the same game, one of them is just soaking in that atmosphere, and then the other ones, which you mentioned, New York and New Orleans, being two sections where it's like, no, that's just the setting for the whole level, and you kind of are in this aftermath in a different capacity. That was one of those things that I appreciated about the new Colossus, and just sort of, for as long as that game is, which I will say I think it's a tad too long, like it still was a game that really allowed you to exist in that world in a multitude of capacities that, the original, the New Order just didn't, right? That was, that Wolfenstein 2 is not a linear experience, but it feels a little more all-encompassing of the world itself. And as much as I love to see Machine Games having success with, Indiana Jones, and naturally I'm sure they're going to be continuing with that for a while, I still would have liked to see them, have another crack at Wolfenstein along the lines of the Old Blood, something that, was afoot in both sort of identities of Wolfenstein, which is one being the New Order approach, but then the other one being its campy, schlocky, B-movie horror aspect that, was established with naturally Return to Castle Wolfenstein and whatnot. And of course, I think it was the 2009 Wolfenstein game. But I love the versatility of Wolfenstein and genre and whatnot. And the fact that, Wolfenstein 2 definitely gets even a little bit of a little schlocky in terms of just like how they expand on like the gear and how much more aggressive things get, thinking about, dual wielding, but it's not just only, a carbon copy of whatever's in your left hand is now in your right. But as you said, you can kind of mix and match with, an explosive in one, a machine gun in the other, shotgun in one, a pistol in the other, or something along those lines. And yeah, also like some of the gear that Blazkowicz can get, like ability to like all of a sudden he's got like stilts, or you can run through walls and you can like bash into Nazis and they just explode. Like I love that they kind of get a little ridiculous with the gear, which is very much in line with like the narrative, tonally speaking, which can be a hodgepodge at times. I guess the only question I have for you about, revisiting Wolfenstein 2, you said that it holds up. How are you finding the narrative? Are you finding it to be a little intrusive? Because for me, when I went back to replay it, I do remember, while it was definitely more refined and it was definitely, a little bit more narratively focused than the previous game, like there was a lot of it. There are a lot of cutscenes in that game. How are you finding it though?
Yeah, it didn't get bothered me, to be honest. I quite enjoyed the story for what it is. I think the thing that helped me this time as well is because I was able to sort of take my time with it. Going back to the U-boat base, like I would go around the place and really interact with it a bit more. I can do all the side stuff, and there's lots of great additional stuff in just wandering around there, like as well, and like finding little side tidbits of story. I mean, it's because, like I said, when you do get those cutscenes, I think on replay, I really did appreciate what they were doing in terms of like building certain characters up. And it's a cartoonish game in terms of its violence and like what it goes for. That's like, the Nazis are played up to the hilt in terms of like being like villainous to the oiled mustache degree, but at the same time, that's good for the story. I think in terms of like, you don't make that end point as good as it is without doing that. Like that. In fact, that a middle point in the game where all seems lost. It's a great tonal shift because of the cutscenes. I think the first half of the game is quite morose. In terms of like Blazkowicz constantly lamenting that he's going to die and like this, and just it's a very glum feeling. But he's still fighting on, and that it kind of gives you the gut punch of like, oh, like what happens in the middle of that game, but how it changes everything afterwards when you get the sort of the big twist of that game. I will say a twist in that game that I called before it came, because I noticed the very distinct thing on his neck in preview images and said, like that's interesting. But yeah, the tone of the game changes to be like really wacky, in that second half. Like things just go crazy. There's I think this is just before, a couple of years before Red Dead 2 came out and did that really big like drunken scene montage thing that was really fun. There's a really good one in this as well, where just like everything is going just nuts and doing weird shit, and like as a night before the big job sort of thing. It's like wonderful, with the tone of this game like that. Yeah, no, I think the complete lack of subtlety and just how big and overblown everything is needed. And like I said, it just feels more and more like the best decision they made.
Yeah. And, for as far as sequels go, just that notion of like bigger and better, I think Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, abides by bigger and more insane, which definitely works in that universe. So it's no wonder it holds up all these years later.
Yeah. What about you, man? You've played a few bits, I believe.
Yeah, I had two games that I played this week that I really thoroughly enjoyed. They both happen to be free-to-play games. So as always, if we're going to be covering a game, usually it's over on Horror Bytes, but if we cover a game that is going to be free-to-play, there's always ways that people can still support the developers. So, if you like the sounds of my two picks this week, you can pick them up on Steam. But at the same time, like, you can buy supporter packs for them. Or in the case of the one that I'm about to chat about now, they have a couple of other games on Steam that are, not free. So definitely, if you like the sounds of, the game that I'm about to chat about, you can check out their Steam page, and that being the Happy Hills Homicide from developer Copperbolt. Now, the way that I would describe this is basically like Hitman by way of Michael Myers, in that you are playing a clown masked serial killer, and the game is comprised of 20 levels that are set up basically like puzzles, in which the end goal is to murder your victim for each of the 20 stages. So it begins very simple. You're in this neighborhood, you need to get into a house quietly, and you need to kill your target. And this is a side-scrolling pixelated game. And so, you have to basically find an item in the environment that is typically the means of your victim's demise, so to speak. And yeah, I found that this was a game that, I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of puzzle games. However, like, this is a game that really speaks to the importance of a story. So, it's not just a series of random kills, which, would have been fine. But I just find that when I get a game that is, more or less puzzle related, like, I just get so much more out of it when there's a narrative driving everything. I find that, I'm more invested in what's happening, and it also just giving more credence to your actions. Now, if there hadn't been a narrative here and it was just like, hey, here's a puzzle game, you need to find out how to do this series of, increasingly gratuitous murders, I probably would have played about half of it and then gotten bored. But the fact that this game has an overarching narrative, it begins seemingly very aimless. Your killing spree, like, you learn more about the killer, you learn more about the people involved, whether it's their victims, you learn more about the town itself of Happy Hills. And you even get like 2 or 3 levels, very brief, but they're narrative levels where you play as the detective that's investigating your, grisly series of kills, which I think further, it just makes me more interested in the world itself. And naturally, it's going to be the setup for the sequel, which people can buy. And I'm definitely going to buy it after that. But after playing this, but I guess I'll give you an example of like what I appreciate about this game in terms of, it being more than just a series of basic kills. It's not just finding a hammer, going into one room, and then you get this like gratuitous little murder scene. There's like layers of what you're doing. So in some instances, it's as simple as you have to avoid like a security light, which then goes off, and then naturally you have to restart the level. Sometimes, you're going to encounter victims that, have firearms. And so you can't get close to them in the traditional means because naturally they'll kill you. But there's one level in particular early on that kind of like speaks to the level of strategy that's involved here and, to achieving your end goal. And that is, you break into a suburban house one night and they have a dog. And naturally, if the dog sees you or you make a loud noise, the dog's going to alert the owner, and then that's level over and you have to restart. However, the thing I didn't mention is that this one particular stage plays out on a night where there's a lightning storm or thunderstorm. And so you have to time all of your actions with the latest crack of thunder, which then muffles the sounds that you're making. And so like those are the types of little sort of puzzles or strategies that go into this game with the various levels that you have to find these like creative solutions essentially to reaching your victims. And then, like I said, you get this really nasty and gratuitous because of the amount of times you have to mash the Z button to like stab them 50 times sometimes, or utilizing parts of the environment. Like there's a hay shredder in one of the levels that takes place in a field, and you naturally know how that's going to unfold with your basically your killer and your victim. So yeah, it's a game that, even kind of like has a Halloween homage in it, where you look through a window at one point and you get to see the killer's viewpoint, but through a mask, basically, much to, the beginning of Halloween. So this was a game that I think took me about an hour to get through, maybe a little bit less than that. But yeah, it was a really well-made little puzzle murder simulator, if you will. But I was just really impressed also with like the the overall production value of it. There's a good mix of stealth puzzle solving, but also the storytelling, and also like the pixel art is really quite good. And there's a lot of dark humor here that's tied into like the kills themselves. Some of them involving fan blades, some of them involve using a trash can lid as a bulletproof vest, if you will. And yeah, it's really fun. And the means of murder get increasingly creative. It's not all just, I'm going to stab this guy 50 times, but utilizing the environment to put down your targets can be quite entertaining at times. So yeah, I highly recommend the Happy Hills Homicide. And yeah, the developer, as I said, they have a part 2, which is over here. It goes for $3, and they even have a game that predates it that's in a similar vein called The Rain Man, which is just $1. So yeah, I highly recommend checking out Copperbolt's catalogs of games, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to report back on Happy Hills Homicide 2 Out for Blood.
I kind of like these kind of games as well because they're two very different games. They remind me of one. Is Blue was a digital Slay Away Camp, which is that's sort of the move-based puzzler based on which homages a lots of classic horror, but also in a similar vein in terms of homage, but in this sort of 2D environment like you've got here. There's a Lakeview Cabin stuff, the collection of those games that I played, which are basically a horror RPG where characters live or die in these situations. And yeah, it's quite a cool little find it in terms of that. Yeah, like it certainly reminds me more of the Lakeview Cabin stuff, in terms of what it's doing. But yeah, those kind of games are fantastic. Yeah, so I don't know what else to ask you on that one, to be honest, because there's a lot of stuff that looks pretty damn good. So yeah, and for the great price of free. So you've got to try that. So
there's not much more to say about this one, but maybe in the future, we can come together and chat about the sequel and see, if they're able to kind of keep that streak alive in that regard. But I think also just seeing, how this developer is able to expand on what clearly worked in the original, but kind of like continue that streak or improve upon it in some way. So yeah, maybe that's something we'll think about for the future.
Yeah. I do like the animations as well, though, for the kills that they show. Like they are very. They definitely enjoyed doing those. Let's put it that way. So what else do you got for us, I suppose?
Yeah, the only other game that I have this week that I was able to spend a good amount of time with, as I said, also happens to be a free game, but you guys can support the developer. Lemazy 5 on Steam with some of their other games that you can pay for. But the one that I'm covering this week, and I don't even know if I'm going to pronounce it right, so definitely check out the show notes for a link to that game. But it being Nascency.
Which I think is a play on naissance, I suppose. But it's a. So before you say too much about it, I did have a question for you because
please.
Yeah, I was looking at it and just thinking, I'm trying to think of a comparison point to this game while looking at it, and all I can come up with was like, it looks like an unfinished Portal mod where you play as the Xenomorph from AVB2. Is that accurate?
That is incredibly accurate. And actually on my notes, because I'm going to talk about, the environmental design in this game that I really love, and my number one reference point is Portal. Portal being, the game from Valve, and like the sort of sterile, I suppose, like test chambers, if you will. Like this is absolutely a game that feels influenced by that. So that's a really great shout on your part, considering you haven't actually played it. So for this game, it is essentially a first-person game that has you exploring what I would just describe as like kind of this like mega structure, if you will, that has a very, portal, but also my other reference point is like the architecture is reminiscent of the brutalist architecture from something like Control.
Yeah, with a bit of Escher in there as well, I think, isn't there, as well, in terms of like it just sort of doubling up on itself, going over different weird angles and stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. And the sort of like overwhelming nature of the size of the environments and the fact that, your goal basically for this game is to just navigate them and finding the quickest pathway through them, and then just continuing on to the other room. Like the narrative is very thin. It's basically, you're this woman that's trying to escape the facility, and that's about it. And it's more a puzzle platformer in that regard, in that, you don't really have any sense of where you are, what's happening, but you just need to get out. And, this results in players being dropped into these, again, sprawling environments. And it really does remind me of, we covered a game over the last few years, like some of those liminal space games, right?
Yeah.
And the one thing that I always found with those games is like, I appreciate the sense of atmosphere. I appreciate that they can be creepy because of the sort of like hollowness of those worlds. And very much you're aware of the fact that you're by yourself, except I don't really have a lot to do. And this game I found to be the perfect sort of like remedy to that. The fact that you're in this liminal space, it is very much like, I would say, this kind of like lo-fi experience where, it has the sort of movement that's akin almost to like Mirror's Edge, where, you can run and jump. And then the only other aspect is when you're running, you will get this little reticle that sometimes will move after a moment. And if you are able to time your click right, it allows you to take a deep breath so you don't stop running, essentially. And that's it in terms of the mechanics. There's no hand holding. It's up to the player to navigate these sprawling environments that have multiple pathways. And that's about it. You kind of just get lost in this world that has environmental puzzles in the sense of like, I need to find this ledge. Maybe I need to interact with this object to have another ledge come out. And then there are some sections where you'll come across these orbs of light that when you interact with them, they'll move, but then they will have some sections of a wall like disappear. And then you'll have to find the correct concoction of touch this orb, don't touch that orb, touch that other orb. And then you find a pathway to kind of like make your way through there. Other than that, it's just like it can be quite challenging, but it is the type of game where I really got lost in these environments and these, like I said, these like monoliths I found to be really, really intriguing in terms of their design, and overall, like the scale of the environment is quite impressive. So yeah, it was a game that, isn't necessarily terrifying, but it kind of operates in that space of like, this is a very ominous place to be. And while you're not like dodging enemies or anything like that, at the same time, like it is very sort of like foreboding and has this like weird magical aspect to it that I think again kind of harkens back to Portal. This notion that there's something going on behind the scenes. You definitely get that. And also there's some organic world that I'll just leave it at that. That definitely like is indicative of a world that operates out of our own. And I found that to just like be complementary to the sense of space and, world of this game.
Yeah, it just looks like a very smart way of doing things in terms of like that idea of like a game environment and like playing around with like the pre-existing versions of that, because it's so sterile, so bleak. It does look, like I said, unfinished in a way that seems very deliberate in terms of the style of it at times. And yeah, it's so mad looking, so striking. I think given that what it's like, I was going to say 11 years old, well, it's 12 years now, but time does go on. But it's from an era where there was this burst of inventiveness in the indie space, and you got all these cool ideas that weren't just necessarily following like the trends as it became more and more apparent what would happen. So yeah, it's despite my description, like naming other games, I think those things don't seem to be like hitting its own identity too much. It does have something very distinct about it, and like you really kind of captured what I felt in looking at it, where the sheer vastness of those environments at times, it just looked so intimidating. I think the camera angles certainly help. I think that in terms of like what's there and what isn't, it's like really interesting looking game, that's for sure.
Yeah, I definitely recommend going into this blind, other than how I've kind of described it, and just kind of like experiencing it for yourself. And I would say that, you and I are very open to a variety of different types of gameplay experiences. And so I guess the only caveat that I will add here is that this is a game that I would say is best enjoyed, and it basically you're forced into it a bit, where it's a single serving type of experience. I don't believe that there's a save option. And there are going to be some instances where that hand holding maybe works against the game slightly, where, I came to one or two sections that I maybe got lost in a loop. And that's only because, there was maybe inconsistencies in terms of the environmental design, that, you come across an environment that's designed in a way that doesn't relate to the rest of the game. And so like you might get stuck in a little bit of a loop here or there. And there's like a physics-based puzzle at one point that doesn't really work all that well. But I would say other than that, just like go into this with an open mind. This is a game that is more about sort of the overall experience of being dropped into this very strange world that, is kind of like very enthralling and has a great, how I would describe the score is that, again, it's like ambient noise and ambient sounds. And that in and of itself helps to further sort of establish this world and the sort of, again, this unknowing nature of space. And you don't know the intention of it. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but you just know that it's somewhere that you don't want to be anymore, which further just like emphasizes the need to get out. But yeah, this is a enjoyable single serving little sort of world exploration, if you will, that, as I said, is free. And this developer has another game called Sens on Steam that, I can't speak to, but it's available for like $18 or something. So that might be worth checking out in the meantime. Yeah, but I think that's going to do it for this week. We didn't have a whole lot in our grab bag, but we had a lot of thoughts on, especially like Dead Space 2, which now, I wish I might have to buy actually an Xbox copy because I've seen there's a DLC for that game that I never played, and it's not available on PC.
Yeah, that's a good little snack size extra.
Yeah, nice. So yeah, maybe that's something I'll have to check out in the interim between the remake and whatnot. But yeah, that's going to do it this week for Safe Room. And as always, my friend, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Okay, man. Till the next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's main feed episode of Safe Room. If you've enjoyed our horrifying discussions, please take a moment to rate and review the show on your preferred podcast platform, as this helps us immensely in ensuring that the show continues to grow. For any and all show updates and additional content, you can follow Safe Room on all of our socials, which are linked in the episode notes, at SafeRoomPod. And finally, you can send any and all emails to saferoompod@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.
Watch The Toxic Avenger now on Screambox. The radioactive superhero that's certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes is available to watch now from the comfort of your home. Bloody FM listeners get a special introductory offer by going to bit.ly/ToxyFM. That's bit.ly/ToxieFM for a special offer on Screambox.
Sometimes you gotta do something.